one of the reasons I think we're spending so much time on particulate matter today is that it's the most important regulatory issue out there. The Obama administration spent 8 years going after the coal industry, and its key weapon in doing that was particulate matter. Particulate matter was used to justify all the war on coal rules, including the climate rule. Most of the alleged benefits from the Obama administration's climate rule actually came from particulate matter, not from controlling greenhouse gases like CO2. Particulate matter it's a health scare that EPA has invented out of whole cloth. They've spent $600 million in taxpayer dollars to invent this scare. They have enlisted many well-known universities in perpetuating this fraud. And so it's an important issue. I know that you're probably like, oh God, this is the fourth guy talking about this, but it's really important. Now, this is my most recent book, and it has the entire PM 2.5 saga in it, from soup to nuts, as I have lived it over the last 25 years. And we're not going to talk about the whole book today. We're going to talk about a very important vignette, which is EPA's human experimentation with PM 2.5. Now, I'm going to dedicate this lecture to the only person in the last 69 years who has died from air pollution. And she didn't die from air pollution. She died at the hands of air pollution researchers, government-funded air pollution researchers from the University of Rochester and MIT. And she died in 1996, and we'll talk about her a little later. Okay, so the human testing controversy at EPA begins with this commentary I wrote in the Washington Times about 5 years ago in July, and it's titled "Show Me the Bodies, EPA." Now, I'm a biostatistician. I have followed the particulate matter controversy at EPA for a long time. I've been participating in it. And the one thing that always struck me is EPA says that, well, there are thousands of people that die every year from particulate matter. Well, who are they? Show us the bodies. And so, I knew EPA was using, as it says, phony death statistics to justify these job-killing rules. And these rules have been very important. These rules wiped out 94% of the market value of the coal industry, $65 billion during the Obama administration. And I thought, as it's highlighted down there, well, it shouldn't be, is it that much to ask for evidence that PM 2.5 has killed anybody? Now, if you're a Monty Python fan, and you see Monty Python, the Holy Grail, this is how they, sort of the translation of that, bring out your dead. I wanted to see them. We even have a picture of the Loch Ness Monster, but I have never seen anyone who's ever been killed by particulate matter or PM2, I call it PM 2.5, fine particulate matter. Now, this is a way to think about what particulate matter is. It's fine soot or dust. It's about 1/10 the size of a human hair in diameter. These little red balls up there in the middle. Sources of PM can be natural, forest fires, volcanoes, pollen, dust. Also man-made, tailpipes, smokestacks, smoking, chimneys, barbecues. People that smoke marijuana, it's all, Cory Booker now wants to legalize marijuana. All particulate matter. So I wrote that piece in the Washington Times in July of 2011, and I was pretty confident that, there's no one that dies from EPA. Then a couple months later, in September 2011, I come across this study, a case report of about an arrhythmia in somebody who's been exposed to concentrated ambient air pollution particles. Well, I'm like, well, where would you be exposed to ambient air pollution? How could this possibly happen? So I read the study, and it turns out that this 58-year-old woman who's a little overweight, 5'7", 220 pounds, she's sickly, family history of heart disease, and EPA is exposing her to, as I write there, 111 micrograms per cubic meter of PM 2.5. That's about 10 times the amount of PM 2.5 that is in average outdoor air. This experiment happened at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. The experiment, her reaction was so severe they stopped the experiment, took her to the hospital in an ambulance, kept her there overnight. Then in the write-up, that's the write-up, They, of course, blame PM 2.5 for this. Now, it took me a while to really put this in proper context, but I started thinking about it. I know what EPA has been saying about PM 2.5, and in 2009, EPA did a scientific report on PM 2.5, integrated scientific assessment. And the first highlight there, EPA basically says that there's no safe level of exposure to PM 2.5. Any level, any exposure, any non-zero exposure, one molecule can kill you, can cause death somewhere, somebody. And then, and the second highlight is section where it says strongest effects observed on lag 1 or lag 0 minus 1. Well, that means that the strongest effects happen on the same day. So EPA is saying that any exposure to PM 2.5 can kill you within hours. Okay, well that's pretty potent. And also in July 2011, there was this piece from the chair of EPA's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Council is a board of outside scientific advisors, Jonathan Samet. He's, I believe, at the University of California, San Diego, I think. Where is? USC, okay, Southern California, all right. So, and he wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine that there's no threshold for particulate matter for which there's no risk at all, no safe level. This came shortly after a letter from then EPA Air Chief Gina McCarthy to Congress, repeatedly saying that there's no safe level of exposure to PM 2.5. This was an earlier EPA assessment where they emphasized that the effect of PM 2.5 can be felt in hours. Okay, so you can die within hours. EPA actually says that. And then this is what really really got me. Then EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson is testifying in Congress in September, about 10 days after that study came out. And so she testifies that particulate matter causes premature death. It doesn't make you sick. It's directly causal to dying sooner than you should. So this is like particulate matter just kills you. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. You're just dead. Okay? In that same hearing, she gets into a little colloquy with Ed Markey from Massachusetts. And Markey basically asks her, well, you know, how big a problem is PM 2.5? And so Lisa Jackson says, well, if we could reduce particulate matter to levels that are healthy, what's a healthy level? 0, right? We would have an identical impact to finding a cure for cancer. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that she believes, EPA believes, that PM 2.5 is killing 570,000 people a year, because that's the number that die from cancer. That's about 1 out of 5 deaths in America caused by PM 2.5. Now, when you think about, so what does this mean for the toxicity of PM 2.5? Well, in fact, you know, EPA, any exposure can kill you in hours. It's really the most toxic molecule on the planet. There's no other substance that can kill there's no other substance, I don't care what it is, what your poison is. One molecule killing you, name a poison that works like that. None. PM 2.5 is the only one. Okay, so that's how serious. I mean, this is what EPA is selling to the public. Okay, the most toxic substance on the planet. And of course, they regulate PM 2.5. I told you about the war on coal rules. This is an example of one, the cross-state air pollution rule. EPA is saying that their rule, which will slightly reduce PM 2.5 levels, will save 34,000 lives a year. Let's go back to the 58-year-old woman. So, knowing that EPA has created PM 2.5 as the most toxic substance on Earth, well, what are they doing exposing this woman to that at a level 10 times higher than is in outdoor air? And so I submitted some Freedom of Information Act requests, and I found out that EPA is, in fact, doing this on a systematic basis. They actually have experiments. And so what are they doing? Well, this is a diesel truck. It's idling. This is an EPA laboratory. They are piping the exhaust from the engine, idling truck, into a gas chamber. This is the gas chamber, okay? So EPA, they're pumping diesel exhaust. They're good enough to take the carbon monoxide out. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. And so what's going on in this chamber? Well, let's just go back and so EPA says that, PM 2.5 causes premature death, and people with heart and lung diseases, children, older adults are most likely to be affected. These are the people EPA thinks are most vulnerable to the effects of PM 2.5. So who is EPA putting in the chamber? Well, you could be an adult guinea pig up to 70 years old, right? This is an ad from the University of North Carolina, I think it's student newspaper or maybe a bulletin board. It's a print ad. EPA is recruiting study subjects. This one, they're looking for people up to 75. Now, remember, EPA is saying, who's most vulnerable? The elderly. In this experiment, they're looking for people up to 80. Okay, that's pretty, that's elderly, right?
No.
Oh, no? I'm sorry. Wrong crowd for that. Okay, remember they also, I believe, mentioned the young. Okay, well, here's an experiment being conducted at the University of Southern California and UCLA. In this experiment, they're spraying diesel exhaust up the noses of children. And how young are these children? What do you think? Any guesses?
8, 9, and 10.
Well, 10. Who said 4? Well, 10. 10-year-old children, okay, at the University of Southern California and University of California, Los Angeles, spraying diesel exhaust up the noses of 10-year-old children. Okay, now what was EPA, diesel exhaust, by the way, is 95% PM 2.5. What was EPA saying about PM 2.5? It's the most dangerous substance known to man, right? So how do they get this stuff approved? Well, when EPA applies to do these experiments, you have to have an institutional review board. It's supposed to be independent of the experimenters. And EPA always describes the risk as minimal. This is quite different than what they tell everybody else, isn't it? Now, just as a sort of tangent for this particular experiment, California determined in 1998 that diesel exhaust causes cancer and there's no safe exposure. But how about these children that are having all this diesel exhaust blown up their nose at USC and UCLA? Interestingly enough, EPA proposed banning experiments on children in 2003, and they finalized the ban in 2006. But these experiments occurred 2004. How about that? Right in that window. When and of course, I'm the one that discovered these experiments were going on, and when I did, I, of course, publicized it on junkscience.com, and what did EPA do? EPA deleted from its database all the information about these experiments. And, several Freedom of Information Act requests and some congressional interest later, they restored them. But let's go back to who's going in that gas chamber. So we have people with metabolic syndrome, okay? Now, these are people that I consider them normal people, but EPA and the public health community consider them to be sick people. People getting older that are a little overweight, a little high blood pressure. EPA is putting them in there. They're putting asthmatics in these gas chambers. Okay, imagine this: 65-year-old asthmatic being experimented on by EPA. Diabetics. Okay. How about the 58-year-old woman? The woman was a walk-in heart attack, right? She has she's 58, overweight, family history of heart disease. She had a bunch of other health problems. Who in their right mind would put her in a gas chamber and expose them to the most dangerous substance known to man, or known to EPA at least? Now recall, we just went over who went into that gas chamber. Who's most vulnerable to PM2? People with heart or lung diseases, children and older adults. What are they trying to do? Okay, so how much particulate matter? Now we know that any level is bad, so in some sense this is a silly discussion, but let's just, we'll just run with it for, I don't know, just piling on, sake of piling on. So there's no safe exposure. Average outdoor air has 10 micrograms per cubic meter. 10 micrograms, that's 10 millionths of a gram per cubic meter of air. EPA's air standards, they will allow communities on a 1 hour basis to have no more than 35, okay? More than 35, you're basically violating the Clean Air Act. Okay, so the 58-year-old woman, well, she's exposed to 10 times the amount of PM 2.5 that's in air, 11 times, and 3 times greater than EPA's acute standard. For the diesel exhaust experiments, EPA is exposing people up to 300 micrograms per meter. That's 30 times greater than, if you consider outdoor air at the level of 10 to be sort of minimal risk. Well, EPA has ratcheted that up to 30 times for their diesel exhaust experiments, including the children. The 10-year-old children got that much diesel exhaust sprayed right up their nose. Many of the PM experiments involve exposures up to 600 micrograms. So that's 60 times greater than minimal risk. And in one experiment where the equipment went crazy, it was 750. Okay, 75 times greater than minimal risk. Now, keep in mind, the EPA says that, this is the most toxic substance. And I know that, I'm repeating myself because I think it's important that you understand. You got to understand the scientific fraud that's going on, the difference between what EPA tells the public and, maybe what it tells these study subjects. Any exposure to PM can kill in as little as hours. There's no safe exposure. Radiation doesn't work this way. The atomic bomb didn't work this way. Nothing works on this basis. Now, after World War II, when we discovered what the Nazis were doing at the Nuremberg Tribunal, one of the judges came up with this Nuremberg Code, which is now famous. Everybody's heard of it. And, I don't want to go through all the details, but the summary is you cannot treat people as human guinea pigs. Scientists cannot treat people as human guinea pigs. The principles have been adopted by the state of California. And in the state of Maryland, where I live, the Court of Appeals, which is the highest court, has previously applied Nuremberg Code to EPA-funded experiments involving lead paint. On the federal side, the federal government has adopted this common rule, and EPA has its own version of the common rule. Nothing more than minimal risk is allowed, and you cannot risk lives to advance a regulatory agenda. You cannot do that. EPA has its own internal rules. There's a presumption against doing studies with any risk of substantial injury or irreversible health effects. Well, what do you guys think about death? Is that reversible? Can you say? Can you bring people back?
It is.
You could.
Easter.
Okay, so these experiments should not be conducted in the first place because they violate every rule designed for the protection of human subjects. So they're fundamentally unethical, if not illegal, on that basis alone. But let's go to informed consent, because this is the part that really got me for the purposes of our discussion of PM 2.5, the regulatory agenda, and what EPA says, and what EPA tells the public. Nuremberg Code requires informed consent. You have to tell people what you're doing to them. You have to inform them of the risks. Okay, and then you have to obtain their consent. And it usually has to be in writing. It's required in the Nuremberg Code, the Common Rule, and even state law. Now, a lot of these experiments have happened at the University of North Carolina, where EPA has a facility, and a lot of the researchers are medical doctors licensed in North Carolina. And of course, in North Carolina, this is probably true almost anywhere, but probably even where you practice, right? Physicians have to get consent from their patients, and if they don't, that violation can be a felony. Okay, that's a felony. Remember, we're going to say this again. Any exposure to PM can be lethal. Lethality can occur within hours. PM kills hundreds of thousands of people annually at current outdoor levels. Old, sick people are especially vulnerable. That's what EPA tells the Congress. That's what EPA tells the public. That's the basis on which EPA regulates PM 2.5 and almost destroyed the coal industry. EPA never said any of this to any of the institutional review boards that approved these experiments. Not one. Okay? EPA only ever told anybody that there's just minimal risk. Well, instant death doesn't sound like minimal risk to me. Now, so I filed my Freedom of Information Act request, and I got back a bunch of stuff, but the stuff that really meant the most to me is, what did EPA tell the study subjects? Because we know what they tell the public, right? PM 2.5 is the most dangerous thing out there. Well, what do they tell the study subjects? How do they get, if you tell someone that I'm going to give you the most dangerous substance known to man, you're going to inhale it for 2 hours, and for the purpose of, advancing my regulatory agenda, and we're going to pay you $12 an hour for, for this privilege. So what's EPA telling these people? Well, EPA tells them during the exposure to the concentrated air pollution particles, you may experience some minor degree of airway irritation, cough, and shortness of breath or wheezing. These symptoms disappear 2 to 4 hours after exposure. Where's the death? What happened to that? Okay? Now, in 2012, I sued EPA about these experiments because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to force EPA to admit that particulate matter doesn't kill anybody and that the agency is lying. Well, one way I try to do this is I sue them to stop an experiment. So there's this experiment called CAPTAIN. Okay, EPA always gave very clever names to its experiments, like King Kong, Ex-Con, and so this one's called CAPTAIN. And in the in EPA's memo to in their response to our complaint, EPA filed a bunch of depositions from its scientists, and they had this one clinical studies coordinator. He testifies, this is in court, okay? This is in court. He testifies that he tells these study subjects, who are mostly college kids or older retired people that have nothing else to do but go earn $12 an hour being tortured by EPA. He claimed that he orally told them, you may die from this, right? How many physicians are here? I mean, it's crazy, right? You may die from this. Outside of this if this was true, this whole experiment would be illegal. But just as, sort of an added aspect to this, even if this were true and you could do this, you would still require a written disclosure. You couldn't just say it orally, oh, by the way, you may die. It's crazy. It's just so you can see I'm not making this up. I mean, this is, he said, this is his actual filing, the deposition, or not deposition, but his statement. I provide participants with information about fine particles. There's the possibility you may die from this. They really say this, or he claims to have said it. Now, this is an EPA researcher, Robert Brook from the University of Michigan, and he works with the American Heart Association he's an EPA funded researcher. He's also mixed up with the American Heart Association, who was involved in this EPA's PM 2.5 scam. In 2010, I guess, Heart Association came out with this statement. I guess they did a little report on PM 2.5, and Brook, he said there's no safe level of PM 2.5 exposure, no safe level. I got the Detroit News to do a little expose on Dr. Brook. I had complained to the Michigan Medical Board about him because if it's true that there's no safe level of exposure, then he's got no business doing these experiments and he should have his license yanked and should be prosecuted. His comment to the Detroit News when they called him was, well, I'm not going to do these experiments anymore because PM 2.5 is so dangerous. Well, what is going on here? I mean, if this is so dangerous, why are they doing it? Right? I mean, it's just incredible. So why does EPA do this? EPA already regulates PM 2.5. I mean, this is circa 2011, 12, and actually it's ongoing. They claim to have thousands of studies that support their regulation, including the epidemiology, animal toxicology, and human clinical studies. These are the human experiments. Well, in my lawsuit with EPA, EPA was good enough to admit that its epidemiology doesn't prove anything. Epidemiology is just statistics, and we all know what Mark Twain said about statistics. Epidemiology is not really a science, it's just kind of a statistical analysis. It doesn't provide any sort of medical or biological or scientific explanation for why things happen. And that's what EPA is good enough to say here. Epidemiologic studies, primary tool in discovery of risks to public health, do not generally provide direct causation. They just they indicate the existence or absence of a statistical relationship or a correlation. And everyone knows correlation is not causation. EPA has done plenty of experiments on animals. This is a picture of one. They take these mice, they jam them into these little tubes and force them to inhale incredible amounts of particulate matter. No laboratory animal has ever died from being forced to inhale PM 2.5. Reality is not helpful to EPA either. Now, I wish I had more time to spend on this, but I'm trying to keep this on the human experiments. There have been 3 episodes of fatal air pollution in the world during the 20th century, in 1930 in Belgium, 1948 in Denora, Pennsylvania, and then there's the 1952 London fog. In all 3, if you read the literature, people actually attributed the deaths that occurred to the caustic gases in the air. You had a temperature inversion. They didn't turn off the factories. And so the acidic gases built up in the air, and people that were vulnerable to that, they're the ones that died. It wasn't the particulate matter. Current episodes of severe pollution in China, India, and Europe, there are no deaths that anyone has ever observed or reported about. I take that back. There have been 2 deaths that have been reported in China, and they were caused by visibility problems. Okay, trains running people over because the visibility is so bad. But nothing from anyone inhaling PM 2.5. Forest fires, I'm looking forward to, I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in Seattle right now. They've got a temperature inversion, and I think they also have smoke from forest fires blowing in. So there's all this smoke in Seattle. I can't wait to find out that there are no deaths there either. Also, underground coal miners are exposed to huge amounts of particulate matter. Non-smoking coal miners live longer than average workers. And then, of course, my favorite is the smoking epidemiology. Okay, now I'm not. I feel like I have to say this. I'm not advocating that anybody smoke. Okay, but smoking epidemiology and talking about smoking makes people feel uncomfortable for some reason. I don't really understand it. Okay, there you go. But the epidemiology is what the epidemiology is. All right. Now we all know the EPA says that any inhalation of PM 2.5 can kill you within hours. Right. Well, let's just keep that in mind. All right. So EPA now one of EPA's EPA says that PM 2.5 can kill on a short-term or long-term basis. Now, if you look at this, Jim Enstrom said that a non-smoker can inhale 1 packet of sugar. Well, Jim, I think it's probably close enough. If you're a non-smoker in Washington, D.C., you spend 80 years there, that's your life expectancy is 80, you're going to inhale about 2 sugar packets worth of PM 2.5 over the course of your lifetime, okay? Now, a couple years ago, there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the message behind the study was, if you stop smoking by the age of 40, you can have normal life expectancy. Okay, so I went in and studied, and I found it interesting. I looked in the study, and I did the calculation, and so what they're saying is that a smoker can inhale this much PM 2.5 and have the same life expectancy as someone who's only inhaled this much. Okay? Now, how can PM 2.5, there's no way PM 2.5 is killing anybody if this is from peer-reviewed research. This is just easy reality calculation. We've all seen people like this, people on oxygen that smoke. Okay, you see them all the time. All right? Well, I thought, people who are very sick, and of course, if you need oxygen, you're very sick, right? That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not a doctor, so I have to confer with mine. So what's the biggest hazard to these people? Is it the PM 2.5 that they're inhaling here? No. Their biggest risk is they're going to set their oxygen on fire. Okay? People on oxygen can smoke for years. Okay, and smoking, you inhale massive amounts of PM 2.5. The air, average U.S. air, if you're breathing average U.S. air, you'll inhale about 10 micrograms in an hour of PM 2.5. If you smoke a cigarette, you'll get 40,000 micrograms in 6 minutes, okay? All right, so EPA was good enough to admit in litigation with me why it's doing this. Since its epidemiology is garbage and doesn't show anything, it's doing these experiments to maybe bolster what it thinks it sees in its epidemiology. So what does that mean? So EPA is conducting these experiments to see if very high exposures to PM can actually kill or harm someone, right? Someone who's exposed to be especially vulnerable, all while claiming there's only minimal risk. Who is EPA lying to? Congress and the public, or the study subjects? Everybody, right. Now, just, let's just wrap this up a little bit. So, when experiments are, if they're fundamentally unethical, you can't do them, okay? That's just, and so this is from EPA's own Human Studies Review Board. If research is intended to seriously harm participants, or if you fail to obtain informed consent, you can't do it. But of course, EPA did it anyway. Now, this is what, so I've been battling EPA now for 5 years about this, and this is all I can ever get out of them to explain, and I feel like I owe this to you. So EPA says, well, the risk of death only occurs in populations. It doesn't occur to people. I'm like, well, okay. Well, populations are made up of people, right? And, when you think about it, so, well, there's 31,000 people killed in auto accidents annually. You could sort of, so these are only occur in populations, not necessarily people. I mean, don't practice this on your way. The next time you're in a car, don't count on this. I mean, this rationale is not going to be good. You remember EPA researcher Brooks said he stopped doing the experiments because they were not safe. EPA just, it can't tell the truth. If you get it to talk, it can't tell the truth. Now let's talk about this poor girl that died in 1996 during an air pollution experiment. One of the things EPA does is bronchoscopies. Is that the right way to say it? Bronchoscopy? Yeah. Okay, all right. Where they stick a tube down your throat. And in her case, EPA was exposing her to PM 2.5 to see if it caused cancer. Okay, now can you imagine that? I mean, they're exposing her so then they can take a biopsy to see if they've initiated a cancer. I mean, the whole thing is sick. Unfortunately for this girl, Nicole Wan, they gave her when they do a bronchoscopy, they have to give you an anesthetic to relax your tubes. They gave her too much and she died. So let's, another prohibition of the Nuremberg Code and the Federal Common Rule, which is the regulation for human protection of protection of human study subjects. You can only do scientific experiments. Okay, you can't just take one person, haul them in off the street, expose. That's not science, right? We all know what science is, and that's not it. EPA's experiments, they're all very small, as few as 4. EPA has tested diesel, wood smoke, concentrated particulate matter from outdoor air, various exposure levels. There's nothing systematic about anything EPA has done. It's not science. Okay, there's no systematic way EPA has looked at this. And I'm not the only one to point this out. EPA has a contractor from the University of Rochester evaluating. And they say that, look, even under the best circumstances, acute transient responses to clinical studies are not useful to predict health effects. Well, this is why we do science. We do science so that we can predict things. As a matter of fact, prediction is the heart and soul of science, right? You come up with a hypothesis, which is a prediction, and you try to verify it. Well, these guys, EPA's contractors, as a matter of fact, at the University of Rochester, they actually conduct some of these experiments. Well, there's no hope of doing that. So why are they doing it? They're really trying to hurt people so they can say they've got a body. This is another report from EPA researchers. Bad science, always unethical. Well, EPA is not bad science, it's not science. So what does that mean? Common rule, I told you, prohibits bad science, right here. Research means a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, values designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Nothing EPA is doing is contributing to that. Okay, now, I've been working on this particular issue for 5 years now. And these are all the different groups I have run into: EPA, National Institute of Health Sciences, Office of Research Integrity, Presidential Commission of Bioethics, a bunch of universities, state medical boards, federal court, the entire human research community. Everybody knows about this. And even the National Academy of Sciences. Okay? They have all stonewalled me. They've all ignored me. They're not interested in pursuing this. I mean, the state medical boards, North Carolina thought about it for a while. Someone talked it out of them, talked them out of pursuing the investigation. Universities stonewalled me. Presidential Commission of Bioethics, the woman who chaired this under Obama, her name is Amy Gutman, and her father escaped the Nazis during the 1930s. You would think that she would be attuned to human experiments. Nope, nothing. Now I want to catch up on the two latest major events in this. So I first filed my first complaint with the EPA Inspector General about the illegality of these things in May of 2012. In October 2012, Congress got around to pressuring the EPA Inspector General to do a report. In between here, we sued EPA, and that lawsuit got washed out. The federal judge said, well, you guys aren't the right party to bring this lawsuit. It's the study subjects that should bring the lawsuit. Well, Your Honor, how are they going to know to bring the lawsuit when EPA is lying to them about what the dangers are? Why would you, it just didn't make any sense. Finally, in March 2014, the EPA Inspector General, he validated our complaints about what EPA was doing, but he did it in such a way that, EPA felt it could continue with its experiments. Then, about a year later, EPA engaged the National Academy of Sciences to review its experiments. Okay? Now, and then between June and April 2016, they held essentially secret meetings about these experiments. When the process was over in June 2016, I learned about these. Someone called me and said, Steve, did you know that the National Academy of Sciences is reviewing EPA's human experiment? I had no idea. So I started making a stink. And in August 2016, Dr. Dunn, Stan Young, who's not here, Jim Enstrom, and myself were offered, they created a special meeting so that we could testify about the human experiments and provide our input. Yes, in March of this year, the NAS issued this report, Controlled Human Inhalation Exposure Studies at EPA. Now, everything is like it's all euphemisms. They don't want you to know what they're doing. Now, so this process at the NAS, the whole thing was secret. EPA, when I complained to the NAS about this, they said, well, our first meeting was public. So I went and looked at the calendar. The only witnesses were all from EPA. There was, as a matter of fact, on the National Academy of Sciences announcement calendar, there was no indication there was a meeting. I mean, this was totally secret. And it was totally secret because they didn't want us showing up. EPA paid for the review. Okay, I don't know if you know, that's how the way the National Academy of Sciences operates, raises money. Federal agencies hire it. They actually hire its arm called the National Research Council to do reports, pay hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And they get what they pay for. EPA paid for the review. The NAS Oversight Committee of the report, of the 19 people in that committee, 13 are financially, professionally tied to EPA. It dodged the central issue of who is EPA lying to. They green-lighted the experiments. So I guess if they green-lighted the experiments, that means that EPA has been lying to Congress and the public. So I took some solace there. When the report was published and I saw that they completely ignored this issue about the conflicts of interest, I asked the president of the NAS, Marcia McNutt. She refused to investigate it. And then following so it was the EPA Inspector General report that triggered that got EPA to hire the National Academy of Sciences, and then now the ball is back in the court of the EPA Inspector General. They just issued this report, which came out August 1st. just last week or 2 weeks ago. They actually they have the temerity to include in this report sort of tripling down or quadrupling down that PM 2.5 can kill you within hours to days. And they still want to conduct these experiments saying this stuff. So when that report came out, I wrote just to show you how disingenuous these people are. So after, when Trump was elected in November of 2016, I got a call from EPA, from the Inspector General saying, Steve, we'd like to talk with you about the human experiments. Now keep in mind, I had first filed with the EPA in May of 2012, 4.5 years ago at that point. They had never contacted me. Now all of a sudden Trump wins and, Steve, we'd like to talk with you about this. So I went in, I spent 90 minutes talking to them. And, my comments were, you would have no idea they talked to me at all. They just sort of, they checked some box someplace. And so she writes back, I complained, I said, listen, there's no indication my comments were considered. The chart that you included showing, talking about short-term mortality and I mean, that in itself should be a giant red flag. Of course, if outdoor levels of PM 2.5 can kill you within hours, then it's illegal it's obviously illegal to test much higher than outdoor levels on humans. And she writes back, remember I gave you that experience. However, the EPA does not ascribe this risk to individuals participating. Of course they don't. Of course they don't. They just say this. I mean, I've never heard this before. Okay, it's just, I mean, they refuse. They just run over you. Whatever you say, they just run over you. Now, this is another famous human experimenter. He escaped the hangman at Nuremberg. But I think that, if this is not an apocryphal quote, but I checked it out. There seems to be a lot of people that think he said this, but if he did, I mean, this is very appropriate. The more we do to you, the less you seem to believe we are doing it. Okay. Now, this is, I worked in the coal industry for a number of years. I tried to tell them, EPA is killing you with PM 2.5, and these human experiments, this is pretty damning evidence. But nobody believed me. There you have it right there. So once again, this whole story, the whole PM 2.5 story is in my book, Scare Pollution. This human testing is only like a vignette of what went on, but you can contact me there. I'm happy to take any questions.
I got a question.
Oh, sit down.
All of the accords, all of the directives to the medical profession that were created after the Nazi scandal don't say you can get by with things if you give them and get an informed consent. They say you can't do any experiments that might harm a human, period. So the informed consent thing is like a red herring. You don't, it's not going to work that way. And the second thing that I think is very important to remember about these people is they were doing experiments hoping to harm somebody. That's called criminal and civil violations of the law. So
There's no other explanation. Right? There's no, in their own words.
And here's the thing that really made me mad. The National Research Council said, well, we think we can probably cobble together a way that the EPA does the research because it really doesn't kill you all of a sudden.
Which is fine. That's a fine answer. I don't have a problem with that. But then they can't regulate. They have to go back to Congress and the public and say we were lying. That's fine.
The point. And when they said that, they essentially exposed the whole lie, which is PM 2.5 doesn't kill anybody. Just like we've been saying for the last 2 hours. And yet, when it comes down to it, the EPA is interpreting the National Research Council report as
it's a green light, right? Now, I think what EPA is missing is that since the Trump administration has come in, as I understand it, these experiments are zeroed out for 2018, so this all may be a moot point. However, I mean, it does expose the corruption going on at EPA, which is really the point going on here.
I'm a huge fan of yours.
So thank you very much.
I have on Freedom Van that's parked out in front right now on the back window in big letters, there's no known safe level of exposure to so-called clean smoke-free air. And then I list all the things that are in clean smoke-free air, you know, bacteria, virus, mold, fungi, spores, animal dander, flakes of skin, you know, all
Yeah.
that, and thousands of chemicals. It says ban smoke bans and neurotic people. But a mutant study I saw a year or so ago, you know, the mutant statistics. Yeah, according to that one, based on pack years, I've been dead for 50 years. I just want you all to know that you're witnessing a miracle. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, just to pick up on that, I'm not advocating smoking, but smoking epidemiology is this wonderful database of information that we have on PM 2.5. You know, there's a lot of people here who work on climate. Okay, well, and the climate debate is never going to end because, well, you know, the adverse events are not going to happen until 2100, at which point, you know, we're all going to be dead. And but we have all this data on PM 2.5. It exists. Okay, we can debunk this once and for all, and so that's what I'm trying to do.
Steve, thanks for giving us such good information in I would say a humorous and enjoyable manner. Thank you. Someone
you,
opened
Bob.
the door to smoking, and I'd like to make 2 points. If you read the Surgeon General's report, they talk of smoking as an epidemic, but they had to cite a study that I had actually used before to the university president, University of California. There's been one twin study, identical twins, where one smoked and the other didn't, that had a long follow-up. The Alzheimer's disease in the one that smoked was 40% of the chance of the Alzheimer's disease in the non-smokers.
Right.
Alzheimer's is going to affect almost all of us if we live to be past 85. And there's about a 1 in 25 chance that you'll die of cancer if you're a smoker, if you started in your teens. So that was the one point I wanted to make in the twin study. So it looks to me like the risk is favorable to smoke. As long as you didn't start in your young teens, and as long as you don't smoke more than about 10 or 15 a day. The second point I wanted to make is we have a neurotoxicologist in our department. And he commented at one meeting, I smoke a pipe in the evenings. He said, Phelan's hand is steadier than anyone in the department. We should all start smoking a pipe at age 40.
I am a junk science reader of your site, and I think I'm going to enjoy it more because of your twist, your humor twist, and your gig'em twist.
My wife's embarrassed by that.
In doing all of this, how do you finance this? Assuming you work, you have a real job, or is this your real job?
No, this
or,
is
you know,
sad
how
to
do you put
say.
it all
Yeah, no, it's.
How do you put it all
Well, I
together?
tell you, when I first started out in this business, you know, I worked for a lobbyist, and of course, that's how I know anything because I worked for a lobbyist and had corporate clients. Then I went to my next consulting job was with the Department of Energy. And then I went off into this, you know, sort of mixture of, you know, private foundations and I had some corporate clients. But as political correctness has you know, skyrocketed and global, you know, fueled by global warming hysteria, all corporate clients have gone away. So just private foundations now support the work that I and other people do. You know, we get accused all the time by the climate bedwetters of, you know, being funded by oil companies and coal companies. No, I mean, I worked in the coal industry for a number of years. And there's no funding going on. That's why they were losing, okay? Because they don't fund anybody. They don't do it. It's just, you know, Exxon. I actually went to the Exxon shareholder meeting this May. I had a shareholder proposal, you know, yelling at them for caving into the climate hysterics. Exxon's on their side. Exxon believes in global warming. Exxon wants a carbon tax. That's not me. That's Exxon. So your question is, you know, the goodness of foundations.
Thanks for your talk, Steve. I can't credit that the EPA wants to kill people because I don't think that they believe, they cannot possibly believe what they say about PM 2.5. It seems overwhelmingly likely to me that they're making, per this morning's presentation, a noble lie in what they view as a noble cause. And part of their noble cause is more power to the EPA, but partly getting rid of PM 2.5 is an end in itself, regardless of whether it does any harm or not. So my question is, what's your goal for the lawsuit and the pursuit?
Well, the lawsuit is over, but I would challenge you on what you just said because
and you are much more familiar with them than I am.
The way I found out about this was this 58-year-old woman. I ran across that study, and of course that study attributed her arrhythmia to PM 2.5. Okay, they went public with that. And the dishonesty operates on so many different levels because if they really believed that, then they would have stopped doing their experiments right away. Okay, but they have continued. Number one. Number two, if you read the whole experiment, they actually say that what caused her arrhythmia was she had, and John can do a better job on this than I can. She had basically an errant electrical pathway in her heart, which caused which went off and caused the arrhythmia, and they actually brought her back in a few weeks later and ablated it, basically fried it, so it didn't exist anymore. And so that was the problem. It wasn't the PM 2.5, but of course they wrote it up as if it was the PM 2.5. And just, Adam, in our lawsuit with them, they said, well, our epidemiology doesn't prove anything. So we're doing these experiments to provide evidence to support our epidemiology. Well, but they're saying that PM 2.5 kills, so are they hoping to almost kill people, but not quite? What's the? If you really believe that any exposure can kill you, you're certainly not going to be experimenting on the people you say are most vulnerable.
So the problem I see is you're applying reductio ad absurdum, and their position is absurd.
Yeah.
But I think if need be, what they'll do is they'll throw all their researchers under the bus and say, yeah, sorry, we were trying to kill people, our bad, but boy, this
Well, no, they won't do that
is
because that's
terrible.
what the National Academy of Sciences report did. It just sort of whitewashed the whole thing. It said, well, these experiments are okay. Because if the experiments were illegal, that would have been the bigger reputational threat to EPA. Because in North Carolina, it is a felony to do things without informed consent. Okay, it is a felony to try to poison people to advance your regulatory agenda. But it's not a felony to lie to Congress and the public because the EPA does that all the time.
So let me offer, my name's Joe Limekeeler. I work in the oil and gas industry, and I fall under EPA regulations for my air permits for the rigs that I use offshore. And the common theme I've seen in EPA that I do not see in the Department of Interior is the mindset that we really don't care at what level you are at. You must make it lower. So, and they will do whatever it takes to justify a cause to force you to get it lower. So we have to do baseline studies for the EPA. Department of Interior, they say, look, we work with the state Clean Air Acts. We work with the states. Whatever the state you're adjacent to requires, we make sure you are adhering to those state mandates and you are within the approved levels. They're not under this directive that wherever you are, I don't care where you are, you could be at 2, got to get to 0. And I think that's the roots, and I see that systemic throughout the EPA staff. That is their mission to whatever it is. It may not be harmful at all, but darn it, you got to make it better.
No, that's right. Well, and saying that there's no safe level of particulate matter or ozone, well, that gives EPA essentially arbitrary control over everything because, they know you can't get to 0, but they can make you do whatever they want, basically.
All right. Thank you, Steve, very much for that. And